Radio for Justice brings you up to the minute news and conversation around the criminal legal system in Colorado and beyond. Welcome to Up to the Minute.
I am Joy Bell Phelan.
And I'm Tiffany McCoy.
And this is Colorado Radio for Justice. Today, we're doing Up to the Minute, a weekly program that takes a close look at the criminal justice system, the legal system, immigration, or other justice concerns happening in Colorado and beyond. Our guest today is Dana Steiner with Colorado Freedom Fund. Happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right in. For anyone that doesn't know what Colorado Freedom Fund is, what is it?
Colorado Freedom Fund is Colorado's only pretrial criminal bail fund. And that means that we post bond for folks who are incarcerated pretrial, and the only reason that they're in jail is because they can't afford their bond. So we do that, and then we also have a policy arm that I'm a part of that works at the Colorado Capitol mostly to pass legislation to keep people out of jail, to get people out of jail, and to just overall make sure that our system is as just as it can be under the circumstances.
How did Colorado Freedom Fund start?
Colorado Freedom Fund, and if you hear me say CFF accidentally, I'm talking about us. CFF started in 2018 as a result of Black Mama's Bailout, which our founder and executive director, Elizabeth Epps, created. She invited members of the community to give so that she could post bond for Black mamas that were in Denver jail. And it was wildly successful. She was able to get quite a few mamas out. And that continued to Father's Day. And then that continued beyond. And so we've been around since 2018.
That's awesome. I love that. I love the name Black Mamas. So what's going on right now with Colorado Freedom Fund?
We are at the end of legislative session. That means we're taking a look back, seeing what needs to be done in the future. And this session, we're still waiting on one of the bills to see if Governor Polis will pass it. But we had two pieces of priority legislation, and I think we're going to be talking about municipal fairness and transparency a lot today. That's House Bill 1147, and it is our number one priority bill this session.
So tell us a little bit more, like, why is that your priority bill? How did that get started this year?
We actually heard about a problem in municipal courts that is kind of an extension of what has been going on in municipal courts for quite some time in Colorado. So we know that municipal courts are the lowest court in the state, but over time, they've actually become the most punitive forum, the most punitive court for low-level offenses in Colorado. We found that out because we heard from a public defender on the Western Slope who said that they had a client who was spending way more time in jail for their municipal offense than they were for their state level offense. And so this person ended up spending 3 times more in jail for their lowest level offense than they were for their higher level offense. And that kind of got us interested in what's going on in municipal courts across the state. Why is this not matching our perception of what municipal courts should be? And when we started taking a look at the more than 220 municipal courts across the state, we found that there were quite a number of problems, particularly with disparate sentencing, like that person on the Western Slope. Folks that were just facing 30 times longer sentences, 10 times longer sentences for shoplifting survival items, for camping violations, for these really what we consider low-level offenses. And from there, we said, how can we fix this? And that's how we ended up with 1147.
So coming from incarceration, I know and have heard of, like, when you get locked up, you go to like city jail, county jail, and then prison. So what is municipal court?
That's a great question. Municipal court, folks usually, and except for in Aurora, which is the only municipal jail in the state, folks are spending time in the county jail for municipal charges. Folks end up in municipal court because of a police officer's decision when they write the ticket. So if you were to look at an Aurora municipal ticket, a Denver municipal ticket, or a Denver state court ticket, they all look exactly the same, and they have two check boxes right next to each other. The officer gets to decide whether to check the county court box for one of these low-level offenses or the municipal court box. And depending on that instantaneous choice by the arresting or ticketing officer, somebody can end up in the city court or they'll end up in the state court.
I think what's interesting about that is when you hear the word city, right, you're thinking Aurora, Denver, Lakeside, like whatever city you grew up in. And I think a lot of people make an automatic judgment that, oh, if it's a municipal thing, it's low level, it's no big deal, right? It's a whatever, it's a speeding ticket, for example. So I'm curious, for someone that maybe doesn't know, didn't look at their ticket, is there any guidance, like is it solely up to the officer that day, which box he's checking as you've described? Or are there supposed to be guidelines around what, I don't know, categories of what would become municipal, what would become state level?
Great question. And you would think that there would be some type of guardrail or guidance to these officers, but there's actually none at all. And we've also heard from reporting out of Aurora and out of Denver that sometimes there's an informal policy to encourage officers to ticket folks into municipal court because those tickets make money. But other than that, and we haven't found any official policies. There's no official policies for this.
When somebody gets put into whatever court they should be in, is there a way out of it? Is there a way to say, like, I don't want to be at municipal, I cannot say that word, municipal court. I would like to settle my case in this courtroom.
There is no way for a person to make that change. There's a couple of more technical ways that the city prosecutor themselves could move that or dismiss the case and have another person bring the charges, but they're completely separate systems. And so at the state level, you have the public defender. At the municipal level, no public defender. It's a completely different set of judges. They follow different sets of rules. And so they're really separate systems. And you certainly can't say, I don't want to be in this one, even though certainly folks have made that comment before. I've heard it in court.
So I'm imagining there's also different budgets, right? Like you mentioned public defender, for example, like if you get a state public defender, if you're in, say, district court, so unless you have family resources or have been, somehow have access, like it's also a budgeting question. Like typically the city doesn't necessarily have funding for public defenders.
That's right. A lot. Colorado has our state public defender system, and Aurora and Denver have municipal public defenders, but no other city of, like I said, more than 200 municipal courts has a public defender. And that doesn't mean that they're exempt from providing attorneys, because we have all heard your Miranda rights. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. And that's still true, or at least it's supposed to be in municipal court. And we found that in some municipal courts, that wasn't happening. A lot of times referencing some type of budgetary issue as to why that's not happening.
Can you give us some examples of maybe some of the sentencing disparities that you've seen?
Absolutely. One of the biggest ones that we see is for unhoused folks who are ticketed with a camping ban or even a trespass violation, which are kind of interchangeable. And at the state level, those tickets are a maximum sentence of 10 days in jail. And we've seen municipal sentences for over 150 days, going upwards of 6-9 months for those types of tickets. So, I mean, those sentencing disparities are 10, 20, 30 times as long. And we've also seen things that are not jailable at all at the state level, folks getting jail time. Things like an old minor in possession of marijuana ticket for somebody who used to be a kid. He didn't know how to deal with it, didn't know how to handle it at the time, popped up, surprised them, and then he got 2 months for something that kids can't be jailed for in Colorado. So even though he was 17 at the time, he still got 2 months in jail. There's a lot of these disparities, mostly for unhoused folks, mostly for poor people, mostly for disabled vets. That's who we're seeing taking pleas for this amount of time, because folks want to be done with their case. They think it's this low-level thing. They want to plead guilty and be done with it.
And 10 days to 150 days can make a real impact in someone's life, right?
A huge impact.
Like, what kind of things can happen in someone's life, like within that time frame?
There's innumerable ways that somebody's life can be impacted from 150 days in jail. And I'll be honest, there's a lot of those things are still true if somebody spends 10 days in jail. And this is something we've heard from folks, is like, only 10 days. 10 days has a lot of the same things. You can lose a job in 10 or 150 days. You can lose your kids. You can lose access to education, your housing, a car if you have car payments, property for folks who are living on the street, and pets. I mean, everything that makes us us gets snatched from you when you go to jail. And I know that you know that.
Yep, we've lived that. So I'm curious. So we know we're talking about House Bill 251147. At what point did Freedom Fund decide we have to attack this legislatively? And how did you sort of decide what would be the pathway you would want to focus on in legislation?
So when we first learned about all of these disparities in municipal court, we also learned that folks weren't getting attorneys. And when somebody doesn't have an attorney, that means they aren't aware of what's going to happen when they plead guilty. They may not be aware of the other consequences. And there's also nobody there to say, this is wrong, this sentencing disparity shouldn't be happening. There's 2 cases at the Supreme Court right now, and it will actually rule on these sentencing disparities. So it won't rule on everything that's in the bill. It won't talk about the attorney access, but it will say if you have the same if you're charged with the same offense in the same place at the same time, you should be subject to the same sentence, whether you're in municipal court or in state court. And so there were attorneys that were willing to take those cases and bring them all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court. Those cases are ongoing. And at the same time, folks are being sentenced right now to these really long sentences in jail. And so whether or not the Supreme Court ends up ruling in the way that we would like them to, HB 1147 is a way to say, yes, this is unconstitutional. It's also unfair. It's not what we do as Coloradans.
So I'm curious, like, as we look at the other side, why would someone be against fairness and transparency in sentencing?
I think the thing that we hear the most about this is that cities should be able to be laboratories, to experiment with public safety, and to deal with local issues in a local way. And by no means does HB 251147 say that they can't do that. It just says that if you're going to play with the big dogs and charge people for an offense that can take away their liberty and have all of these other impacts on their lives, that you need to have the same limitations and play by the same rules as the state court does and as our Constitution says. And cities shouldn't be able to experiment on our poorest neighbors, the most vulnerable folks, in the name of public safety. These low-level offenses are folks who are stealing to survive, stealing for food, shelter, and in order to just make it to the next day. This isn't a bill that touches on public safety in a lot of ways that we hear at the Capitol.
Who are your sponsors for this?
The bill sponsors are Representatives Mabry and Velasco and Senators Amabile and Weissman. So there's a good range of folks from different places around the state with different interests, and they've been really great champions for this bill.
And are there other organizations also that are like in the battlefield with Colorado Freedom Fund?
So many other organizations. I think our count is up to past 75 at this point. And there's folks from who are doing economic policy. There are folks who have an interest in immigration law because this bill also has impacts on folks' immigration consequences. There's folks who are fighting for racial justice. There's folks who are fighting for youth, and everywhere and anywhere in between.
So where is the bill right now?
The bill right now is waiting to go to Governor Polis's desk. It's already passed the House, it's already passed the Senate, and it will be delivered to Governor Polis, and we've been encouraging him vigorously to sign it.
You mentioned you had another bill that you all were working on this year. What was that one?
That bill was HB 25-1015, and it was clarifications to online bond payments, which means that there already is online bond payment, or there should be, across the state. That happened in 2022, should have happened in 2022, but we haven't seen it really bloom like we wanted it to, and so that everybody, no matter what jail they are held in, could have someone post their bond remotely. And so we're hoping that this bill kind of smooths out some of the confusion, makes some clarifications to say, yes, every jail needs to have online bond payment, and that needs to be available to folks' parents that are on the other side of the mountains or on the other side of the state. So while we are fighting to get rid of cash bonds, specifically wealth-based detention, but until then, we want folks to have every single avenue to their freedom, and that includes online bond payment.
I have a question. I need to go back to the very beginning. How does a bill become a bill? Where does that start?
Bills start usually with a problem, hopefully with a problem, right? Hopefully we're not just searching for something. And we start with a problem, and then the folks that are interested in that problem will kind of start talking to one another and figuring out, have you found a solution to this? Have we figured out how to get people counsel? Have we figured out a successful argument in court to make sure that people don't get these sentencing disparities? And when there's no solutions left, we've talked to people who are decision makers and they don't want to change their decisions. We've talked to legislators and said, are you interested in this? And they will approach us and say, have you heard about this problem? And then we'll do investigating. Lots of research and investigation up at the front, and then talking to folks, figuring out where are the problems with this idea that we have. And then drafters draft the legislation. That's actually a job title at the Capitol. You can be a drafter. And workshop it over and over and over again, and keep going back to folks that are interested in it. And then hopefully it's ready to be introduced. And that's where kind of how a bill becomes a law usually picks up.
I feel like this is where we would have like the vignette from Schoolhouse Rock of how a bill becomes.
Absolutely.
I remember that, but I don't remember it.
How the process worked. For people that don't know, they've never had to bail anybody out of jail. What's the difference between bail and bond?
We usually don't make any difference between those. And there are some very technical ways that we could talk about that. But I think that there's actually folks that would disagree with our interpretation. So the way that we think about bail and bond is we post people's bond / bail. It is the amount of money, the monetary condition of bond. You'll sometimes hear it called. But there's other ways that folks can get free that don't involve money. And that would also be bond. So usually we're talking about money bond. There's other things that folks could do to secure release. Sometimes they're released into somebody's care or home. They could be, we often talk about ankle monitors, not something that Colorado Freedom Fund supports because that's another way to limit folks' freedom, has a ton of secondary consequences. But bond money part is usually what we're talking about.
So what are one or two or three things that people should be looking for coming up with Colorado Freedom Fund?
I would say first is keep an eye on 1147. We have put out quite a number of calls for folks to call the governor's office, and that'll continue until he signs it. And then the other thing is that ballot initiatives are coming in quickly. Colorado Freedom Fund is working and will be working in coalition to combat some of these carceral initiatives that we're seeing. And those will come to a head at the election both this fall and next fall. So kind of a long term, keep an eye out for. Head to our website, coloradofreedomfund.org. We'd love for folks to follow us on social media as well, join our mailing list. That's how we keep folks in the loop.
So I know we don't have a ton of time, but I know that there's going to be somebody out there in the world that is questioning, we have an Eighth Amendment. Why do we need this? Why did these bills matter? Why does Colorado Freedom Fund exist? We have a constitutional amendment. How would you respond to that?
The constitutional amendment says folks have a right to not have excessive bail. And for a long time, that meant very little in Colorado and across the country. And in 2013, Colorado had some some statutory changes where we kind of explained what that meant a little bit more and said that judges need to consider people's ability to pay bond when they set bond. And there's quite a number of things that judges are supposed to consider when setting bond. Ability to pay is one on a long list. And we often see folks who definitely cannot afford their bond. And that's certainly why we exist. But there's arguments before the court where somebody's defense attorney will say, Judge, my client can only afford a $50 or a $100 bond. And whether or not that's made on the record, judges will set bonds that are higher than what people can afford. There's been a long line of cases, both federally and in the state, about all of this. And it comes down to kind of judicial discretion and the other purposes of bond and how people who think differently than we do interpret them. And so I say, how could you say that a $200 bond isn't excessive when somebody has $0? And that's the same as setting a $2 billion bond. And the courts just don't buy it. So, decision makers continue to make these decisions with the vast discretion that they have. And we continue to push for policies that lean in the direction of liberty and say your discretion is no longer allowed in this. And when somebody is charged with the lowest level offense, you can't charge them to get out. And that's kind of some of our older pieces of legislation. And I'm sure we'll want to continue to expand it.
I'm curious, this also makes me think about, there's been a lot of conversation around, largely in like the mandatory minimum space, of giving the judges more discretion because mandatory minimums aren't working. Like we've seen that. We all know people that have been incarcerated to obscenely long amounts of time because of mandatory minimums. So it almost sounds like you're also saying that no, the judges shouldn't have that discretion. So how do we sort of balance the needs of, in a case like mandatory minimums, right? We maybe do want some judicial discretion because maybe they would see some reasons to not sentence someone to 48 years. But in this case, it almost could sound like you're saying, no, we don't want that discretion. How do you sort of balance those two competing ideas?
That's a great question. I think that this idea of discretion and good discretion or bad discretion, I think it really helps to ground it in the system and the systemic issues that folks are facing when they're brought into court. Discretion for a judge means if we open up full discretion, then you have folks who are sentenced to 180 days for stealing $10 worth of food. Then if we close it, you have those mandatory minimums. One thing that we use to kind of think about this a lot is the ratcheting effect and visualizing what these mandatory minimums do. Because if let's say, for instance, we have a mandatory minimum for like third-degree assault, but we don't have a mandatory minimum for second-degree assault. It's going to keep pushing up those mandatory minimums over and over again until, and then you hear like, oh, well, what about an assault on a healthcare worker? Why doesn't that one have the mandatory minimum? Or why doesn't that one have the aggravating factors for sentencing? And so that has been going on for decades, that ratcheting bit. And that's where we've seen this explosion of felonization and everything. And so really what we're talking about is ratcheting it back down to say no more mandatory minimums. We're going to look at the top and say, is that really where the top should be? And lower that.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Is there anything else you would like to add to the conversation before we close out?
I would just encourage folks to contact Governor Polis, let him know why you think fairness and transparency in municipal courts is important right now, why he should sign this bill. You can head to our website. There's a whole toolkit there available. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on Colorado Radio for Justice with Up to the Minute. I am Tiffany McCoy. This is my co-host, Joybell Phelan, and we are with Dana Steiner from Colorado Freedom Fund.
Up to the Minute is a production of Colorado Radio for Justice. Tune into our 24/7 broadcast on www.radioforjustice.org. Listen on the app from the App Store and Google Play. Catch this show and other original works shifting the narrative on the criminal legal system on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Colorado Radio for Justice.